Keeping this one calm.
In stores, take a close look at the Orchid Mystique, coming up next on HGTV.
Thanks for watching HGTV's Weekend Garden Guide. Join us every weekend at 3 Eastern for great gardening advice, information, ideas, and inspiration.
Orchids, an original wildflower.
We're talking about 10% of all of the flowering plants in the world.
They're everywhere.
We're creating a feeling here.
They're elegant.
Some are very, very rare.
And elusive.
Others are like weeds.
They just might become a lifelong obsession.
They're almost hypnotic.
For us, orchids are a window to the world.
Don't resist the allure of the Orchid Mystique. Coming up next on HGTV, Home and Garden Television.
The following
Beautiful, bizarre, and beguiling orchid, the crown jewel of the jungle. Can you resist its exotic allure?
Here is perfection in the plant kingdom.
Admire its extravagant elegance too closely? Inhale the demanding fragrances too deeply? Try to possess it, and it may well possess you. Tempted? Of course you are. For the Orchid Mystique is part art, part science, and all adventure.
You can raise orchids anywhere, either in a Manhattan apartment or in an estate in Southern California or anywhere else in the world.
I've seen orchids growing in the Amazon wild, and their roots are splayed all over a tree trunk. They're not necessarily confined to any given space.
Behind the Orchid Mystique is one simple truth. Orchids are really wild flowers.
Orchids are everywhere. We just don't notice them sometimes.
Some are very, very rare, and others are like weeds.
There's one that grows here in the Bronx, in fact, that pops up between sidewalk cracks.
In nature, orchids pop up in every country in the world. From the North Pole to the South Pole, there are nearly 30,000 different species of orchids growing in the wild.
We're talking about 10% of all of the flowering plants in the world being orchids.
And that's not all. More than 150,000 hybrids have been created by crossing different orchids together.
There's so much diversity in this particular plant family. You know, just the fact that this is an orchid with those tiny little flowers and has all the same parts as this orchid, you know, with huge flowers.
An astonishing array of orchids is available today. Their flowers come in single blooms, clusters, sprays, and chains with bizarre shapes and patterns and evocative names. The elusive ghost, the blood-red breathless. An antelope dendrobium has twisty, curly horns. The dancing lady waves her arms and wears a petticoat. And the famous Angraecum sesquipedale of Madagascar is shaped like a star with a long comet tail.
It's very waxy. It almost feels like plastic. This flower is so unusual because of the nectary, and you can see how long it is.
Nearly 150 years ago, this odd feature captivated Charles Darwin, the father of modern evolutionary theory, who then made a startling prediction in his book on orchid pollination.
Darwin theorized that there had to be a night-flying moth that had a tongue long enough to land on here, have its tongue go all the way down to get to that little bit of nectar at the bottom. It'd have to be really long.
Although no one had ever seen a moth with a 12-inch tongue, such a creature was later discovered in Madagascar, proving that Darwin was correct. The extravagant shapes, colors, and fragrances of orchids are designed to entice insects or other pollinators, not people. All orchids have the same basic structure: 3 outer petals called sepals and 3 inner petals, one of which is typically a lip or a landing platform for an insect.
But there's something about orchids that really draws people's attention. They're almost hypnotic. Orchids were actually used medicinally by ancient Greeks as aphrodisiacs.
But the only emotion they aroused was greater love of orchids. Almost 2,000 years later, the shameless beauty and lurid shapes of orchids mesmerized English Victorians. Brave orchid hunters set sail toward the equator and the untamed heart of the world's tropical wilds. Orchid lust was driven by many different desires.
A lot of these people were early scientists.
But others were in it for the money.
They were out there to get the best looking and the nicest orchids and ship them back to Europe and put them in the auction houses where they brought great big prices.
Today, you can find orchids at festivals, florists, and grocery stores. Hundreds of brand new hybrids are created each year. Millions more are grown from seed or cloned. Some have papers and pedigrees and price tags to match. Others are a beautiful bargain. But buyers beware. Your first orchid may be just the beginning of a lifelong obsession.
Orchids is a religion with some people. They really take it to heart. It gets deep into them.
They breathe, sleep, and dream orchids.
It's a passion with a past.
Orchids may be at least 100 million years old, if not older.
And an unlimited future. But if you're just getting started, here are 4 easy-to-grow favorites. First, the popular Phalaenopsis or moth orchids. Next, the Cattleyas, the classic corsage flowers. A third group, the Paphiopedilums or slipper orchids. And finally, the dazzling dendrobiums. With one of these fabulous 4, you're bound for success. The world of orchids is one big web of endless adventures. One thing leads to another. Orchids as houseplants. Orchids in greenhouses. Orchids for show. Orchids for science. Even orchids for dessert.
Makes a great ice cream.
Vanilla flavoring, coming from the seeds of the vanilla orchid. You can never know all there is to know about orchids. With every answer comes a new question.
For us, orchids are a window to the world.
And what a world it is. Stay tuned for one wild adventure after another. First up, the Victorians and their shamelessly showy orchids. In the 19th century, orchids were the sole province of the rich. But these bewitching beauties are within reach of people from everywhere and every walk of life today. Every Mother's Day weekend, a Victorian fantasy land awaits you at the Huntington Gardens Orchid Festival in Pasadena. Garden director Jim Folsom tells the tales of Victorians and their orchids.
The Brits especially, but all the Europeans fell in love with these glorious orchids that were showing up from the tropics.
To supply the nurseries of England and Europe, hundreds of people went thousands of miles to find orchids. Orchid mania was a booming business and a costly one.
The payoff was that when you had a big party, you had this. And people oohed and awed and salivated, and it was just a wonderful thing. What more do you want?
Extravaganzas such as this were once a royal treat for the privileged few. But all are invited to feast their eyes on these floral wonders. The colorful, cool-growing mastivalias. The reed stem epidendrums with their bamboo-style growth. And the most luscious of them all, the showy Cattleyas. Gail Scher is festival director.
It's a very different sense of what an orchid festival is all about. We're creating a feeling here, and a beautiful one at that.
Now a very public place, this mansion estate was the private retreat of Henry Huntington, a railroad tycoon from back east, who collected books, art, and exotic tropical plants. Today, his experimental orchid collection has grown to over 5,000 plants, and his Cymbidium orchids, planted in 1911, are still growing strong. Planet Earth boasts many beautiful places, but the sun always shines most brightly on the tropics, a great swath of land and sea that follows the equator and wraps the world in a band of warmth. Here, from the rainforests to the cloud forests, the world's most coveted orchids were born. At the Atlanta Botanical Garden, Ron Dieterman gives expert care to nearly 1,000 orchids from around the world.
From Alaska to the tip of South America, there are native orchids everywhere and everywhere in between.
But today, as in Victorian times, the most popular orchids are the shamelessly showy plants, whose heritage is rooted in the tropics.
These are some of the Cattleya orchids, and these are some of the wild forms as they occur in the wild. And some of these were really the pride and joy of early collectors.
Cattleyas are native to the tropics of Central and South America, where they grow in the rainforest as epiphytes, or tree dwellers. In fact, most tropical orchids grow in the air as epiphytes, attaching themselves to limbs.
They're not parasites, so they don't take anything out of the tree, and they don't tap into their host tree. They purely use it for support, so that they can get to the light, up into the trees.
Other orchids grow on the ground, their roots shimmying across the surface, like these striking slipper orchids.
This is one of the Asiatic slipper orchids, and you can see the shoe here. One of the petals is a pouch, and that's why it got its name, the slipper orchid. This is another slipper orchid, one of the South American slipper orchids, and it's interesting to see how long the petals are of this orchid. See, they keep on growing. If they don't hit anything, they keep on growing, till the flower runs out of steam.
Many orchids like to dry out between waterings, and they often have swollen stems or pseudobulbs for water storage. But other orchids like a climate that is consistently wet.
This is a spider orchid, a brassia, and it's growing right here next to this little waterfall. And obviously, in the wild, they usually like nice, moist environments as well.
Some like it hot, others like it cold.
This fog system basically enables us to grow a lot of orchids that normally might grow in montane regions, in the mountains.
In most of the United States, you can grow many warm-growing orchids outside in the summer months. But in Hawaii, coastal Southern California, South Florida, and all along the Gulf Coast, you can landscape with orchids year-round. Third-generation orchid lover Bob Fuchs of RF Orchids in Homestead, Florida, specializes in vandas and their hybrids for the landscape, like the fabulous pencil orchid used in Hawaii to make leis and to garnish tropical drinks.
And all the orchid flowers are also edible. You put them in your salad, edible color.
Bob's own yard is decked out with 1,000 different orchids, front and back, bed after bed, and tree to tree. This bright gold terete vanda blooms constantly year-round, and the flowers of this terrestrial vanda last for 3 months. In another day and age, Victorians in northern climates imagined the steamy jungles where their floral captives thrived. Then they built hothouses, cranked up the heat, and warmed their orchids to death.
Many of the finest orchids that were ever found that have ever lived were torn out of the wild, sent to England and Europe, and grown for a short period of time and killed.
Added to this whole business about these exotic plants from exotic places that were so gorgeous was the idea that they were hard to grow, making them even more tantalizing.
Orchids are as tantalizing today as ever, but you can grow them if you select orchids that match your environment. Here are the basics. Orchids like to chill out a bit at night. The warm-growing orchids, like the moth orchids, enjoy the same nighttime temperatures that most people do, from 65 to 70 degrees. Intermediate orchids, like the cattleyas, like a bit more nip in the night air, around 60 degrees. And cool-growing orchids, like the Draculas, need to hang out between 50 and 55 degrees at night. Light is energy for your orchids. To grow them inside, you will need a bright light window or an artificial light garden. Finally, orchids need to breathe freely. They need fresh, humid air that is in perpetual motion, so open a window or turn on a fan. The 20th century was destined to be the golden century of orchids. The 1922 discovery of a method for germinating as many as several million dust-like seeds from a single orchid seed pod was a landmark in orchid history. A second landmark was World War II.
Germany was bombing all the English cities. The orchid growers were losing their collections. Millions of dollars worth of orchids were sold and sent to America.
Where the popularity of orchids exploded, the possibilities were and are infinite. Next, how many orchids is enough? The orchid population explosion.
Rex and the beige carpet.
Worst enemy when you take over the weed.
Orchids were democratized. Practically a symbol of peace and prosperity, orchids were proudly worn for all sorts of special occasions. In 1946, Owen Holmes, fresh out of the Marine Corps, went home to Newberry, South Carolina, and with his cousin Bill Carter, cornered the corsage market.
We looked around for something to distinguish ourselves in, and the orchids looked like it. We could buy them directly out of the jungles in South America or elsewhere at very low prices.
These were happy times in the U.S. of A. While the big bands played, couples swayed with Cattleya mossii from the wilds of South America.
This is similar to the type of orchid that we grew in those days. Up and down Main Street in Newberry, and you'd see dozens of Garden Homes orchids.
By the 1960s, flower power was in, but corsages were out. Orchids had lost their groove, but not for long.
We determined to become orchid hybridizers and sell plants, and that is where we are today.
In total, American orchid growers produce more than 12 million plants a year. While some target the mass market, others cater to the dedicated hobby growers who enjoy collecting a variety of unusual orchids. At Carter & Holmes, Gene Crocker is the mastermind behind many specialty orchids for the serious hobbyist. This hybrid, yet to be named, involves 2 species from South America and the South Carolina mosquito orchid.
I find it very interesting that an orchid from South America and an orchid from South Carolina can be bred together.
The record proves that orchids hybridize together very easily in the lab. The Carter & Holmes Crossbook documents more than 7,000 crosses.
The last ones that were entered in the book were entered as number 7,452.
To create new hybrids, Gene selects proven parents or studs from a collection of superior plants started more than 50 years ago by Bill Carter and Owen Holmes.
We're now in the stud house where we keep some of our best plants. These plants literally come from 6 continents. We have here a plant that grows in South America, it's a Phragmipedium. This is one of our favorite orchids because not only does it look pretty, it's an oncidium, incidentally, called Sherry Baby. Not only is it good looking, it smells like milk chocolate. I like it.
Remarkably, a single act of pollination can produce millions of dust-like seeds. Equally astounding is the fact that not a single seed will grow unless it meets up with the right fungus it needs for food in the right spot, like the crevices of tree bark. The chances can be 1 in a million. Now, hybridizers can reproduce the conditions that orchid seeds need to grow inside a bottle. And today,
you can actually germinate and grow all the seed in a pod, so we could actually grow 1 million plants from a seed pod.
But you do have to have sterile conditions, so Carter & Holmes has a first-rate lab where technicians oversee the growth of orchids in sterile flasks.
This particular thick transplant has about probably 2,000 plants trying to grow in there.
Eventually, they will be replanted, 35 seedlings to a flask. All in all, they spend about 1.5 years growing in bottles until they are mature enough to grow on their own in the nursery. Interestingly, many of the orchids available today are not grown from seed at all. They are cloned in a test tube, and each new plant is an exact duplicate of the original. A plant might be selected for cloning because of its flower, rarity, season of bloom, or outstanding color, like this Cattleya hybrid, Breathless. Many of these young Phalaenopsis clones will be the first ever orchid for beginner hobbyists. Here's what beginners need to know about the perils of overwatering. The roots of tree-dwelling orchids are exposed to the air, and they like to dry out between daily showers. When orchids are sold as houseplants, they are often planted in a chunky orchid mix that allows airflow to the roots and stores water. When the mix dries out, every 7 to 10 days, give your orchid a good soaking by holding the roots under running water for a minute or 2. Watering your orchid too often causes the mix to compact and the roots to rot. Your only hope then is to repot. If you're successful with one orchid and want more, new ones are on the way. Hybridizers are always on the lookout for superior studs, like this Cattleya, a division of a plant collected in South America in 1888.
So this plant is over 110 years old, and it could live to be several hundred years if properly cared for. orchids renew themselves with these new growths, and so they can live indefinitely as long as the conditions are right.
Once established, orchids are far from fragile, especially in nature.
They look so gentle and so dainty and like they could be damaged, and they're out there in this incredibly harsh environment just doing their thing.
Hobby grower Larry Mays has found orchid treasures from the mountains to the jungles.
To see an orchid in bloom in the jungle is similar to seeing a jewel in a bracelet or a ring. It just jumps out and strikes you.
We'll be right back with Everyday People, Extraordinary Orchid. Today, orchid mania is alive and well and spreading like a fever. People from all walks of life are confessing to an outright orchid addiction.
Orchid fever is a name for this disease that hits people, this desire to collect, to obtain one of every orchid on Earth.
I got infected at an early age.
As soon as I got the first two, it was just like instant disease, and I just had to have more.
And more, and more, and more.
I'm responsible.
Yes.
I am responsible for what started here.
15 years ago, Larry and Linda Mays of Atlanta innocently embarked on what has become a lifelong adventure when Linda gave Larry 2 orchids for Valentine's Day. Today, they have more than 1,500 different species of orchids and 2 temperature-controlled greenhouses in their backyard.
The overwhelming thing about any orchid greenhouse is there's a mass of green. They spend a lot of their time growing, so it's always a thrill to see that flower come out.
Larry is not only addicted to orchids, he's addicted to adventure.
I just had to go see an orchid growing in its natural habitat.
Together, they've hiked off the beaten path around the world, collecting with legal permits and photographing orchids.
If it says on the map, do not go here, that's where we're going first.
Brazil, Mexico,
Alaska, Montana, South Africa,
Hong Kong,
Australia, Guatemala, Costa Rica.
The first time we went to Costa Rica, I wanted to find the first orchid so bad, and she probably found 10 before I ever saw my first one. I remember looking at that wall of green, and I was just sure that the second we walked in there that there were just going to be all kinds of things jump on us. It was almost a thrilling but foreboding thing at the same time.
Their cool-growing greenhouse is now home to this cockleshell orchid from the mountains of Guatemala and this slipper orchid from China.
But believe it or not, this is also an orchid, and that is in full bloom. If you can see the little white spots, those are fully open flowers. They're about 1/16 of an inch across.
Their warm-growing greenhouse is for low-altitude plants.
We're trying to keep the humidity very high in here. We're trying to keep it very warm, sultry, almost hot, very sticky feeling, what most people think of the jungle. This is a little orchid from Asia. It's called Ascocentrum miniatum, and it has these small, brilliant orange flowers. Here's another one that comes from India. This is a phylogeny orchid. They're typically white, long chains of flowers like that.
The dendrobiums offer a dazzling array of fragrances.
They're usually very highly scented. We have one that smells just like grapes, and another one that smells just like cherry cough syrup, one that smells just like a fresh peeled tangerine. Just as orchids grow at all levels in the forest, we try to recreate that in the greenhouse by putting those plants closest to the roof that need the most sunlight. And then we let them naturally shade the plants that would grow closer to the forest floor.
But their orchid mania doesn't stop there. Linda collects 19th century English lithographs featuring the very orchids that drove Victorian collectors wild.
The colors are still so vibrant. They're just stunning reproductions of the actual orchids that were collected.
And Larry is a botanical artist whose carved glass illustrations have been praised by the Smithsonian. You might say that Larry and Linda are heavily into orchids.
I came out one day and there was a huge sag in the middle of the greenhouse, and I thought, oh my gosh, it was just that the orchids had finally gotten so large that they were tearing the greenhouse down.
To see some really weighty orchids in the wild, here's how. The American Orchid Society, headquartered in West Palm Beach, can steer you to a long list of orchid hunting expeditions. Should you happen upon native orchids, like these American lady slippers, growing in your own backyard, remember,
all orchids are on the endangered species list, and it's against the law to move them, no matter where they are.
To collect them from nature, at home or in a foreign country, special permits are required. Unless you are conservation-minded hobbyists like Larry and Linda, the best way to capture an orchid in nature is with a camera. The most elusive orchid in America, the ghost orchid, lives in an 84,000-acre wilderness known as the Fakahatchee, a swampland in the Florida Everglades. John Beckner, an orchid specialist from Selby Botanical Gardens in nearby Sarasota, knows this place like the back of his hand.
There are bears, there are deer, there are panthers, there are mink, there are otters.
And plenty of alligators. It's against the law to remove the ghost orchid from its swampy home, but according to popular legend, some folks will go to any length to obtain it. Others just want to see it in bloom.
They're not easy to find. They're here, but they're scattered. And we're going to have to walk back a ways and look. Looks like a ghost, looks like a frog leaping in midair, looks like whatever you want to say, but it's a fantastic thing.
The Fakahatchee has the greatest concentration of rare plants to be seen anywhere in the United States, including about 50 different species of orchids.
Right directly over my head, up there, you can't see it very well, is a little orchid that's one of the rarer species. It's on a limb.
Epidendrum floridense, but it's not the ghost orchid.
This tree has several species of orchids growing on it with seed pods. There's the seed, millions of seed going out, hopefully making orchid plants. Quite a nice little orchid garden right here on the tree.
But no ghost orchid. The day wears on, the wildlife stirs, the search continues. Where is the ghost orchid?
We have found the ghost orchid.
Growing on its favorite tree, the pond apple. And it's all but invisible. A severe drought has delayed its bloom.
If you'd like to wait, there are 2 buds that are going to open up there in perhaps within 3 or 4 weeks. So they're logs. We can sit down and hope for rain. Okay?
The ghost orchid has eluded its viewing public once again, but there's still hope.
We're going to see the ghost orchid.
This time, for the ghost orchid, there's no way out. Stay tuned. A captive ghost orchid makes a rare public appearance at the Redland International Orchid Festival. As ever, and you can find them at orchid festivals across the nation. 15-year-old hobbyist Paul Marcellini of Homestead, Florida, is lucky. The Sunshine State is an orchid hobbyist's mecca, boasting 6 or more orchid shows each weekend in the spring and 2 or 3 a weekend in the fall. On the festival circuit, Paul has made friends with growers from around the world, like Jose Portilla of Ecuador.
I always think of him. When I am coming to Miami, I said, this I am sure that Paul would like.
Paul enjoys the challenge of growing unusual species. At home, he has nearly 3,000 orchids in his greenhouse, his indoor terrariums, and his backyard. But at the Redland International Festival in Homestead, he plans to buy a few more.
Yeah, that's really good.
And I was thinking also about these. Look, these tails. This is beautiful.
I got these 2 because they had really interesting leaves. This one I've wanted for a while. It's got a big flower on it for a small plant. This one he was describing to me, it sounds really nice. It gets a long spike with little flowers on it.
Paul has been active in his local orchid society since age 9. In fact, the American Orchid Society has 30,000 members worldwide and nearly 450 affiliate societies throughout the U.S. At the Redland Festival, the focus is buying, and there's plenty of fuel to fire the obsession. Greg Butler of Oak Hill Gardens in Chicago has brought a rare prize.
We normally don't grow it in the bird cage. I put it in there to keep somebody from plucking it off and running away with it. It's probably worth quite a bit of money, although it's invaluable to us. Really, there's no price tag on it.
Leaping lizards. It's the blooming ghost orchid. And it does look like a jumping frog.
There's a lot of folklore behind it, and I'm sure the plant would just assume that everybody leaves it alone and just lets it be in the Fakahachi.
But maybe you prefer a black orchid. Try Black Magic.
It's black, it blooms at Halloween.
Running short on cash? No problem.
The flask like this is only $15, and you're getting anywhere from 40 to 100 plants in there, you know, depending on how many of the little ones you want to keep and mess with.
Running out of space? No excuse. With miniatures, there's a little something for everyone. Here's one that can fill a whole room with its fragrance. At the Carter & Holmes booth, Gene Crocker shows off a Cattleya creation.
This is a dwarf grower that has a beautiful green flower with a beautiful lavender lip.
And the award-winning Phalaenopsis Newberry Parfait. Its AOS Award of Merit gives it extra cachet. Flowers are judged on a scale of 0 to 100, with the highest honor being the FCC, or First Class Certificate. Judges consider color, size, shape, and substance, as well as the way the flowers are carried on the stem. But some people like really ugly orchids. Just ask Jean Monnier of JEM Orchids of Delray Beach.
I like freaky things, I guess. Wow. Bulbophyllum Phalaenopsis. This one is pollinated by flies. It looks like dead meat with fungus growing on it.
So it smells bad?
Yeah, real bad. Rotted meat fragrance.
Others are marvelously strange and rare.
The parent plants cost over $20,000 a piece to get a hold of one, so they're going to stay kind of high for a while until more of those are in cultivation.
But this floriferous miniature offers bang for the buck.
Wow. Definitely consider that one.
Yeah, it's a good one, especially if you're cramped for space. You don't have to worry about that.
I think I'll get that, because that's what I wanted that for a while, too.
The hobby of collecting orchids adds up pretty quickly.
My greenhouse is really packed right now. It's when you know you need a new greenhouse to get more stuff.
Oh, did you see these?
Every orchid is not for everyone. Here are some simple tips to guide your first orchid purchase. Some orchids can take years to go from seedling to flower, so choose a mature plant that is already in flower. Also, start with hybrids because they're created for hobby growers. Finally, select plants that match your temperature and light environment, and you and your orchid will be much happier. Many pursue orchids for the art of it all, but others seek them for science, to learn how orchids have become the largest group of plants on Earth. These scientists are ever mindful of the pioneering orchid hunters of the past.
Those people were really adventurers. There were no roads, conditions were terrible, and there are a lot of gravestones around in the tropics. They didn't necessarily come back.
Stay tuned. Modern-day orchid hunters return to tell their tales. Behind the orchid mystique lie endless enigmas. Orchids are affordable, yet priceless. Fragile, yet survivors. Rare, yet everywhere. Scientists like John Atwood at the Selby Botanical Gardens in Sarasota, Florida, hope to unlock these mysteries. How many different native orchids exist and why? No one knows for sure.
The public is starting to hone in on that same fascination with all these different forms and color patterns. You've got greens, you've got yellows, you've got purples. What explains this great diversity of orchids?
Selby Gardens is a beautiful place to sit or stroll and enjoy the beauty of the bay. Behind the scenes, it's a serious scientific institution and home to the Orchid Identification Center and 6,000 orchids.
The Orchid Identification Center identifies orchids, and that's, of course, a tricky business with 25,000 species of orchids and all the complications, and they come from all over the world.
The center processes more than 1,000 orchid identification requests a year from individuals and institutions.
We constantly find new and undescribed species. It's not at all uncommon to go out on a trip and spend a day in the woods in the right places like Ecuador, Borneo, Colombia, and come back with 6 or 8 undescribed new species in a single day.
But it's not dainty work.
you have to be very careful. You can really have big problems.
Some of the native inhabitants don't care if you have the proper permits.
I was bitten by a fer-de-lance, which takes the fun out of living for a few days. That's a snake. It's a very poisonous snake.
At the Selby Orchid Identification Center, collectors can sometimes match their plants directly to one that's already been identified among nearly 40,000 dried herbarium sheets, 17,000 preserved flower specimens, photographs, and illustrations. This specimen was sent in for identification by a couple from Arkansas who found it growing in their yard. It was a direct match with a new species of American lady slipper identified in 1980.
It was called Cypripedium kentuckiense. Magnificent big flower. I spread the sepals apart in one of these things, and I got 8 3/4 inches. This flower was so immense.
But if no record can be found, your orchid may be new to science. A Selby scientist will write a formal botanical description and give it a name. Then, botanical artist Stieg Dahlstrom will illustrate it. Such was the case with Phragmipedium bessii, said to be the most important orchid discovery of this last century.
It was an orchid discovered by Elizabeth Bessie, who worked here at Selby Gardens.
This one trip she came back from, and she brought in a herbarium specimen, dried, and asked me to please identify it.
And it turned out to be this flamboyant, world sensational new orchid species that shook the whole orchid world.
This was something incredible because it was bright red. This is something new and unknown. So the end result was we described it and I named it after her.
Phragmipedium bessii. In her native habitat in Ecuador and Peru, she is a sight to behold. Back in Atlanta, Ron Dieterman knows that Bessie needs to lead a rocky life with lots of water and cool temperatures.
And you see there's another spike coming, and it's going to bloom again, so.
The orchid is more than just another pretty flower. If you know something about how orchids survive in nature, you're on your way to being orchid-wise. What truly distinguishes one orchid from the next is how they have evolved to attract specific pollinators, such as insects or birds. Orchids can be downright deceptive, like this oncidium.
To us, it looks like a little dancing lady, but to a male bee, it looks like an enemy.
When the male bee attacks the orchid in defense of its territory, it unknowingly picks up the pollen to carry to another flower. This orchid is pollinated by hungry gnats who mistake its lip for a mushroom. Other orchids shoot their pollen like a gun when the insect partner hits the trigger. Some insects, like these North African bees, are attracted by fragrance.
But these fragrances are very, very strong, and this is what keeps the various species of orchids apart. A specific species of bee will zero in on a specific fragrance produced by the plants.
Today, orchid extinctions are outpacing orchid identifications as land is cultivated, cities built up, and factories installed.
It isn't just the orchids we're losing everything that goes with it.
Orchids have generally been considered sort of the poster child for endangered plant species. We all know about endangered elephants, rhinos, pandas, but how many young people could name an endangered plant species?
Most everyone's favorite flavor of orchid, vanilla, is practically extinct in the wild. Stay tuned to find out what's at stake besides real vanilla ice cream.
Orchids can be a passion which you have all your life.
You can grow up with orchids, you can grow old with orchids, but you'll never grow tired of orchids.
And this is a photograph of me with my very first orchid that I got for my 10th birthday next to my sister and my mother. You can tell from our hairdos that this was 1977.
More than 20 years later, Ken Cameron is a botanist at the New York Botanical Garden trying to get to the bottom of the orchid mystique by unraveling orchid DNA.
One of the great mysteries and enigmas in orchid biology is why orchids are so rare and yet there are so many different species.
Ken uses genetic fingerprinting to construct orchid family trees to understand how orchids got to be the largest and most diverse group of plants on Earth. The New York Botanical Garden has more than 5,000 living orchid plants. The garden centerpiece is the Victorian glass house, a shimmering, fanciful palace built more than 100 years ago to house a vast collection of exotic plants.
We bring orchids into that central atrium, and the contrast of these brightly colored orchids reflecting into this pool of water surrounded by towering palm trees is really breathtaking.
In part, Ken's research is devoted to everyone's favorite flavor of orchid, vanilla, an orchid native to Mexico and central to real vanilla ice cream.
Vanilla orchids were brought from the Spanish explorers to Europe, and the spice became very popular, particularly in France. We've all heard about French vanilla ice cream, for example.
Some of the finest vanilla produced today comes from Tahiti and Madagascar. Among orchids, vanilla is unique.
Most orchid species are epiphytes, meaning that they grow on other trees or plants. Vanilla is somewhat of an epiphyte, but actually it starts its life in the soil. As they climb into the trees hundreds of feet, the lower portion of the vine can die, leaving the vanilla vine as an epiphyte to climb higher and higher.
The vanilla vines can be 300 feet long, with 50 or more flowers at each leaf.
After being hand-pollinated, these flowers take up to 9 months to reach maturity, and the pods themselves hang down in large clusters that are hand-picked.
The vanilla beans are actually the orchid's seed pods, which have been cured and fermented.
Inside, you'll find thousands and thousands of tiny vanilla bean seeds.
The other interesting thing about vanilla is that it's nearly extinct in the wild.
Habitat destruction is the culprit, and there's more at stake than vanilla. The rainforests have the greatest concentration and diversity of plant species of any place on Earth, providing us with oxygen and the promise of new food sources and medicines. Dedicated conservationists Anne and Walt Esworthy believe that saving the rainforest begins at home. They have transformed their own yard into a tropical showplace.
We do not attempt to tame the jungle. We have our paths, we have the things we've incorporated, but we keep it natural.
Anne and Walt's orchid adventures began later in life when they retired to this secluded piece of property on Sarasota Bay. Their exposure to the orchid world through nearby Selby Gardens brought wonder, then wisdom.
Our knowledge of plants has broadened our other comprehensions too. We just see more in life.
Through the woods, Anne and Walt have an open-air orchid shed with a built-in misting system.
I love the way it feels when the wind is blowing the mist. You feel like you're in a rainforest.
As the orchids come into bloom, they hang them near the house or bring them inside to better enjoy the fruits of their labor.
For 19 years, Walt and I did all of the work. We started putting the epiphytes on the trees.
To establish new orchids, Anne wraps the pseudobulbs securely against a tree with a cut-up nylon stocking. There's always room for one more orchid. To grow a variety of orchids successfully, it helps to think back to nature. Larry Mays gathers clues on how to grow his orchids better by looking at the plants themselves. A fat, floppy leaf indicates that the plant grows in the shade.
And so it has a lot of leaf surface trying to gain as much light as it can.
This Laelia from Brazil grows in bright light.
The leaves are growing almost straight up on this plant. These grow in the very tops of the trees, and they're actually trying to shield themselves from the sun.
Its swollen stems, or pseudobulbs, store water, which tells us that it goes through a dry period. The key is to give your orchid the same treatment it gets in nature. Orchids will woo you, orchids will wow you, and sooner or later, orchids will win you.
You might say, who grows orchids? Everyone.
Even if you buy the orchid at a local store, that's your first step to a better understanding of the world around you.
There's an interesting story here that has to do with what we perceive as beautiful and our relationship to the natural world. And it's inseparable.
And ever evolving.
That's another good thing about the orchid business. If you don't like what you see today, come back tomorrow and there'll be something different.
They're dynamite.